Good evening. We are online. Let me just change my screen a little bit. So, on December 4th, I read the first half of the essay entitled The Spiritual Problem of Modern Man, which appears in Civilization in Transition, Volume 10 of the Collected Works of C.G. Jung. But I sort of said, well, you can go read the rest of it yourself. But in the fullness of time, I see that we need more and more spiritual help, given the situation of the day. And so I thought I'd better come back and finish the reading. So the Gnostics were a sect of Christians who were put down by the Catholic Church in the 2nd century. And it seems that the reason they was that they believed in having a direct experience with God. And the church wanted to interpose itself between the average person and God. And so they managed to crush out Gnosticism. But what Dr. Jung found as he studied this in the 20th century is that we need the experience, the direct experience. And indeed, the direct experience is the basis of things like Alcoholics Anonymous and other cures and healing. And so if you have that experience, then you know. You don't have to believe any longer, you know. And but it is quite right that if you know, then you don't necessarily need a creed of any kind. So anyway, why did creeds come up anyway? Well, as Ernest Becker and my friend Sheldon Solomon found in the late 20th and early 21st century, the main reason for God or reason for religion is because of humanity's fear of death. And so let me settle it for you right now. You have nothing to fear from death, because when you're dead, you don't know you're dead. It's only difficult for your family. When you're stupid, it works the same way. And so, but that doesn't mean that there is no place for religion. Certainly there is, and religion has a role. And so this essay, which Dr. Jung wrote in 1928 originally, so 90 years ago, is still relevant, although it makes reference, for example, it refers to 2 decades of psychological study. Now we're at a century of it, and it refers to certain religious sects which are not common today, but there are others, so it is all relevant. So I'm going to begin on paragraph 167, and so it's important to remember that in Dr. Jung's oeuvre, each paragraph represents one psychological fact, and these psychological facts, these psychic facts, are very complex. They have many different facets to them. So it's like a very complicated Christmas tree ball or something like that. And so it's important to understand what each paragraph means. Obviously, you may have to refer to the actual written text, but I'm going to do my best to do a decent reading of what's left of this particular essay. Paragraph 167. The rapid and worldwide growth of psychological interest over the last 2 decades shows unmistakably that modern man is turning his attention from outward material things to his own inner processes. Expressionism in art prophetically anticipated this subjective development, for all art intuitively apprehends coming changes in the collective unconscious. So I think that Dr. Jung may have overstated the coming interest in inner processes. I don't see that many people in the United States as yet who are interested in their own inner processes, but that is coming. So, going on. Paragraph 168. The psychological interest of the present time is an indication that modern man expects something from the psyche which the outer world has not given him. Doubtless something which our religion ought to contain, but no longer does contain, at least for modern man. For him, the various forms of religion no longer appear to come from within, from the psyche. They seem more like items from the inventory of the outside world. No spirit, not of this world, vouchsafes him inner revelation. Instead, he tries on a variety of religions and beliefs as if they were Sunday attire, only to lay them aside again like worn-out clothes. So he's pointing out religion's role is to give us experience of the psyche, and indeed he, on several occasions, talked about religions as being early versions of psychic therapy. Paragraph 169. And yet he is somehow fascinated by the almost pathological manifestation from the hinterland of the psyche. Difficult though it is to explain how something which all previous ages have rejected should suddenly become interesting. That there is a general interest in these matters cannot be denied, however much it offends against good taste. I am not thinking merely of the interest taken in psychology as a science, or of the still narrower interest of the psychoanalysis of Freud, but of the widespread and ever-growing interest in all sorts of psychic phenomena, including spiritualism, astrology, theosophy, parapsychology, and so forth. The world has seen nothing like it since the end of the 17th century. We can compare it only to the flowering of Gnostic thought in the 1st and 2nd centuries after Christ. The spiritual currents of our time have, in fact, a deep affinity with Gnosticism. There is even an Église agnostique. There is even an Église gnostique de la France, and I know of 2 schools in Germany which openly declare themselves Gnostic. The most impressive movement numerically is undoubtedly Theosophy, together with its continental sister, Anthroposophy. These are pure Gnosticism in Hindu dress. Compared with them, the interest in scientific psychology is negligible. What is striking about these Gnostic systems is that they are based exclusively on the manifestations of the unconscious, and that their moral teachings penetrate into the dark side of life. as is clearly shown by the refurbished European version of Kundalini Yoga. The same is true of parapsychology, as everyone acquainted with this subject will agree. Paragraph 170. The passionate interest in these movements undoubtedly arises from psychic energy, which can no longer be invested in obsolete religious forms. For this reason, such movements have a genuinely religious character, even when they pretend to be scientific. It changes nothing when Rudolf Steiner calls his anthroposophy spiritual science, or when Mrs. Eddy invents the Christian Science. These attempts at concealment merely show that religion has grown suspect, almost as suspect as politics and world reform. Paragraph 171. I do not believe that I am going too far when I say that modern man, in contrast to his 19th century brother, turns to the psyche with very great expectations, and does so without reference to any traditional creed, but rather with a view to Gnostic experience. The fact that all the movements I have mentioned give themselves a scientific veneer is not just a grotesque caricature or a masquerade, but a positive sign that they are actually pursuing science, i.e., knowledge, instead of faith, which is the essence of the Western forms of religion. Modern man abhors faith and the religions based upon it. He holds them valid only so far as their knowledge content seems to accord with his own experience of the psychic background. He wants to know, to experience for himself. Paragraph 172. The age of discovery has only just come to an end in our day, when no part of the earth remains unexplored. It began when men would no longer believe that the Hyperboreans were one-footed monsters or something of that kind, but wanted to find out and see with their own eyes what existed beyond the boundaries of the known world. Our age is apparently setting out to discover what exists in the psyche beyond consciousness. The question asked in every spiritualistic circle is, what happens after the medium has lost consciousness? Every theosophist asks, what shall I experience at the higher levels of consciousness? The question which every astrologer asks is, what are the operative forces that determine my fate despite my conscious intention? And every psychoanalyst wants to know, what are the unconscious drives behind the neurosis? Paragraph 173. Our age wants to experience the psyche for itself. It wants original experience and not assumptions, though it is willing to make use of all the existing assumptions as a means to this end, including those of the recognized religions and the authentic sciences. The European of yesterday will feel a slight shudder run down his spine when he gazes more deeply into these delvings. Not only does he consider the subject of this so-called research obscure and shuddersome, but even the methods employed seem to him a shocking misuse of man's finest intellectual attainments. What is the professional astronomer to say when he is told that at least 1,000 times more horoscopes are cast today than were cast 300 years ago? I'll just read that sentence again. What is the professional astronomer to say when he is told that at least 1,000 times more horoscopes are cast today than were cast 300 years ago? What will the educator and advocate of philosophical enlightenment say about the fact that the world has not grown poorer, by a single superstition since the days of antiquity. Freud himself, the founder of psychoanalysis, has taken the greatest pains to throw as glaring a light as possible on the dirt and darkness and evil of the psychic background, and to interpret it in such a way as to make us lose all desire to look for anything behind it except refuse and smut. He did not succeed, and his attempt at deterrence has even brought about the exact opposite, an admiration for all this filth. Such a perverse phenomenon would normally be inexplicable were it not that even the scatologists are drawn to the secret fascination of the psyche. There can be no doubt that from the beginning of the 19th century, ever since the time of the French Revolution, the psyche has moved more and more into the foreground of man's interests, and with a steadily increasing power of attraction. The dethronement of the goddess of reason in Notre Dame seems to have been a symbolic gesture of great significance for the Western world, rather like the hewing down of Wotan's oak by Christian missionaries. On both occasions, no avenging bolt from heaven struck the blasphemer down. Paragraph 175. It is certainly more than an amusing freak of history that just at the time of the Revolution, a Frenchman, Anquetil du Perron, should be living in India, and at the beginning of the 19th century brought back with him a translation of Upanektat, a collection of 50 Upanishads, which gave the West its first deep insight into the baffling mind of the East. To the historian, this is a mere coincidence independent of historical nexus of cause and effect. My medical bias prevents me from seeing it simply as an accident. Everything happened in accordance with a psychological law, which is unfailingly valid in personal affairs. If anything of importance is devalued in our conscious life and perishes, so runs the law. I'll start that sentence again. If anything is devalued in our conscious life and perishes, so runs the law, there arises a compensation in the unconscious. We may see in this an analogy to the conservation of energy in the physical world, for our psychic processes also have a quantitative, energetic aspect. No psychic value can disappear without being replaced by another of equivalent intensity. No psychic value can disappear without being replaced by another of equivalent intensity. This is a fundamental rule which is repeatedly verified in the daily practice of the psychotherapist and never fails. The doctor in me refuses point blank to consider the life of a people as something that does not conform to psychological law. For him, the psyche of the people is only a somewhat more complex structure than the psyche of an individual. Moreover, has not a poet spoken of the nations of the soul? And quite correctly, it seems to me, for in one of its aspects, the psyche is not individual, but is derived from the nation, from the collectivity, from humanity even. In some way or other, we are part of a single, all-embracing psyche, a single greatest man, the Homo Maximus, to quote Swedenborg. Paragraph 176. And so we can draw a parallel. Just as in me, a single individual, the darkness calls forth a helpful light, so it does in the psychic life of a people. In the crowds that poured into Notre Dame, bent on destruction, dark and nameless forces were at work that swept the individual off his feet. These forces worked also upon Anquetil de Perron and provided an answer which has come down in history and speaks to us through the mouths of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. For he brought the Eastern mind to the West, and its influence upon us we cannot as yet measure. Let us beware of underestimating it. So far, indeed, there is little of it to be seen on the intellectual surface. A handful of Orientalists, one or two Buddhist enthusiasts, a few somber celebrities like Madame Blavatsky and Annie Besant with her Krishnamurti. I'll just read that again. Let us beware of underestimating it. So far, indeed, there is little of it to be seen on the intellectual surface. A handful of Orientalists, one or two Buddhist enthusiasts, a few somber celebrities like Madame Blavatsky and Annie Besant with her Krishnamurti. These manifestations are like tiny scattered islands in the ocean of mankind. In reality, they are the peaks of submarine mountain ranges. The cultural Philistines believe until recently that astrology had been disposed of long since and was something that could be safely be laughed at. Once more. The cultural Philistines believed until recently that astrology had been disposed of long since and was something that could safely be laughed at. But today, rising out of the social deeps, it knocks at the doors of the universities from which it was banished some 300 years ago. The same is true of Eastern ideas. They take root in the lower levels and slowly grow to the surface. Where did the 5 or 6 million Swiss francs for the Anthroposophist temple at Dornach come from? Certainly not from one individual. Unfortunately, there are no statistics to tell us the exact number of avowed theosophists today, not to mention the unavowed. But we can be sure there are several millions of them. To this number, we must add a few million spiritualists of Christian or theosophist. To this number, we must add a few million spiritualists of Christian or theosophist leanings. Paragraph 177. Great innovations never come from above. They come invariably from below, just as trees never grow from the sky downward, but upward from the earth. The upheaval of our world and the upheaval of our consciousness are one and the same. Everything has become relative and therefore doubtful. And while man, hesitating and questioning, contemplates a world that is distracted with treaties of peace and pacts of friendship, with democracy and dictatorship, capitalism and Bolshevism, his spirit yearns for an answer that will allay the turmoil of doubt and uncertainty. And it is just the people from the obscurer levels who follow the unconscious drive of the psyche. It is the much derided silent folk of the land who are less infected with academic prejudices than the shining celebrities are wont to be. Looked at from above, they often present a dreary, laughable spectacle, yet they are as impressively simple as those Galileans who were once called blessed. Is it not touching to see the offscourings of man's psyche gathered together in compendia a foot thick? We find the merest babblings of the most absurd action. We find the merest babblings, the most absurd actions, the wildest fantasies recorded with scrupulous care in the in the volumes of Anthropophatia, while men like Havelock Ellis and Freud have dealt with like matters in serious treatises which have been accorded all scientific honors. Their white world, how are we to explain this zeal, this almost fanatical worship of everything unsavory? It is because these things are psychological. They are of the substance of the psyche, and therefore as precious as fragments of manuscript salvaged from ancient middens. Even the secret and noisome things of the psyche are valuable to modern man because they serve his purpose. But what purpose? Freud paragraph 178. Freud prefixed to his interpretation of dreams the motto, "If I cannot bend the gods on high, I will at least set Archeron in uproar." But to what purpose? Paragraph 179. The gods whom we are called upon to dethrone are the idolized values of our conscious world. Nothing, as we know, discredited the ancient gods so much as their love scandals, and now history is repeating itself. People are laying bare the dubious foundations of our belauded virtues and incomparable ideas, and are calling out to us in triumph. There are your man-made gods, mere snares and delusions tainted with human baseness. White sepulchres full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness. We recognize a familiar strain, and the gospel words which we failed to digest, at confirmation come to life again. Of course, this was written in 1928, so 10 years after World War I and about 11 years before World War II began in earnest. Paragraph 180. I am deeply convinced that these are not just vague analogies. There are too many persons to whom Freudian psychology is dearer than the Gospels, and to whom Bolshevism means more than civic virtue. And yet they are all our brothers, and in each of us there is at least one voice which seconds them, for in the end there is one psyche which embraces us all. Paragraph 181. The unexpected result of this development is that an uglier face is put upon the world. It becomes so ugly that no one can love it any longer. We cannot even love ourselves, and in the end there is nothing in the outer world to draw us away from the reality of the life within. Here, no doubt, we have the true significance of the whole development. After all, what does Theosophy, with its doctrines of karma and reincarnation, seek to teach except that this world of appearance is but a temporary health resort for the morally unperfected? It depreciates the intrinsic value of the present-day world so no less radically than does the modern outlook. But with the help of a different technique, it does not vilify our world, but grants it only a relative meaning in that it promises other and higher worlds. The result in either case is the same. Paragraph 182. I admit that all these ideas are extremely unacademic, the truth being that they touch modern man on the side where he is least conscious. Is it again a mere coincidence that modern thought has had to come to terms with Einstein's relativity theory and with nuclear theories, which lead us away from the determinism and border on the inconceivable. Even physics is volatilizing our material world. It is no wonder, then, in my opinion, if modern man falls back on the reality of the psychic life and expects from it that certainty which the world denies him. Paragraph 183. Spiritually, the Western world is in a precarious situation, and the danger is greater the more we blind ourselves to the merciless truth which, Paragraph 183. Spiritually, the Western world is in a precarious situation, and the danger is greater the more we blind ourselves to the merciless truth with illusions about our beauty of soul. Western man lives in a thick cloud of incense, which he burns to himself, so that his own countenance may be veiled from him in the smoke. It's telling it like it is. I'll read that sentence once more. Western man lives in a thick cloud of incense, which he burns to himself, so that his own countenance may be veiled from him in the smoke. But how do we strike men of another color? What do China and India think of us? What feelings do we arouse in the black man? And what about all those whom we rob of their lands and exterminate with ruin and venereal disease? I have an American Indian friend who is a Pueblo chieftain. Once when we were talking confidentially about the white man, he said to me, "We don't understand the whites. They are always wanting something, always restless, always looking for something. What is it? We don't know. We can't understand them. They have such sharp noses, such thin, cruel lips, such lines in their faces. We think they are all crazy." Paragraph 185. My friend had recognized, without being able to name it, the Aryan bird of prey, with his insatiable lust to lord it over in every land, even those that concern him not at all. And he had also noted that megalomania of ours, which leads us to suppose, among other things, that Christianity is the only truth, and that white Christ the only Redeemer, and that the white Christ the only Redeemer. After setting the whole East in turmoil with our science and technology, and exacting tribute from it, we send our missionaries even to China. The comedy of Christianity in Africa is really pitiful. There, the stamping out of polygamy, no doubt highly pleasing to God, has given rise to prostitution on such a scale that in Uganda alone 20,000 pounds are spent annually on preventives of venereal infection. And the good European pays his missionaries for their edifying achievements. Need we also mention the story of suffering in Polynesia and the blessings of the opium trade? That is how the European looks when he is extricated from the cloud of his own moral incense. No wonder that unearthing the psyche is like undertaking a full-scale drainage operation. Only a great idealist like Freud could devote a lifetime to such unclean work. Sorry. It was not he who caused the bad smell, but all of us, we who think ourselves so clean and decent from sheer ignorance and the grossest self-deception. Thus our psychology, the acquaintance with our own souls, begins in every respect from the most repulsive end, that is to say, with all those things which we do not wish to see. Paragraph 187. But if the psyche consisted only of evil and worthless things, no power on earth could induce the normal man to find it attractive. That is why people who see in theosophy nothing but lamentable intellectual superficiality, and in Freudian psychology nothing but sensationalism, prophesy an early and inglorious end of these movements. They overlook the fact that such movements derive their force from the fascination of the psyche, and that it will express itself in these forms until they are replaced by something better. They are transitional or embryonic stages from which new and riper forms will emerge. Paragraph 188. We have not yet realized that Western theosophy is an amateurish, indeed barbarous, imitation of the East. We are just beginning to take up astrology again, which to the Oriental is his daily bread. Our studies of sexual life, originating in Vienna and England, are matched or surpassed by Hindu teachings on this subject. Oriental texts, 10 centuries old, introduce us to philosophical relativism, while the idea of indeterminacy, newly broached in the West, is the very basis of Chinese science. As to our discoveries in psychology, Richard Wilhelm has shown me that certain complicated psychic processes are recognizably described in ancient Chinese texts. Psychoanalysis itself and the lines of thought to which it gives rise, a development which we consider specifically Western, are only a beginner's attempt compared with what is an immeasurable art in the East. It may not perhaps be known that parallels between psychoanalysis and yoga have already been drawn by Oscar Schmitz. Paragraph 189. Another thing we have not realized is that while we are turning the material world of the East upside down with our technical proficiency, the East, with its superior psychic proficiency, is throwing our spiritual world into confusion. We have never yet hit upon the thought that while we are overpowering the Orient from without, it may be fastening its hold on us from within. Such an idea strikes us as almost insane. Perhaps we have eyes only for obvious causal connections and fail to see that we must lay the blame for the confusion of our intellectual middle class at the doors of Max Mueller, Oldenburg, Deussen, and Wilhelm, and others like them. What does the example of the Roman Empire teach us? What does the example of the Roman Empire teach us? After the conquest of Asia Minor, Rome became Asiatic. Europe was infected by Asia and remains so today. Out of Sicilia came the Mithraic cult, the religion of the Roman legions, and it spread from Egypt to fog-bound Britain. Need I point out the Asiatic origin of Christianity? Everybody having fun? Mean Joe Hicks says, I am a bit behind the live stream. What did he mean by the cultural Philistines? All you have to do is turn on your cable news and you'll start to get the idea. Paragraph 190. The Theosophists have an amusing idea that certain Mahatmas, seated somewhere in the Himalayas or Tibet, inspire and direct every mind in the world. So strong, in fact, can be the influence of the Eastern belief in magic that Europeans of sound mind have assured me that every good thing I say is unwittingly inspired in me by the Mahatmas, my own inspirations being of no account whatever. This myth of the Mahatmas, widely circulated in the West and firmly believed, far from being nonsense, is, quite like every myth, an important psychological truth. It seems to be quite true that the East is at the bottom of the spiritual change we are passing through today. Only this East is not a Tibetan monastery full of Mahatmas, but lies essentially within us. It is our psyche, it is our own psyche, constantly at work creating new spiritual forms and spiritual forces which may help us to subdue the boundless lust for prey of the Aryan man. Excuse me. Oh, excuse me. I might be allergic to that. I'll read that again. Wait a minute. So, it is our own psyche constantly at work. It is our own psyche constantly at work, creating new spiritual forms and spiritual forces, which may help us to subdue the boundless lust for prey of Aryan man. We shall perhaps come to know something of that narrowing of horizons which has grown in the East into dubious quietism, and also something of that stability which human existence acquires when the claims of the spirit become as imperative as the necessities of social life. Yet in this age of Americanization, we are still far from anything of the sort. It seems to me that we are only at the threshold of a new spiritual epoch. Rest, the longing for rest in a period of unrest, the longing for security in an age of insecurity. It is from need and distress that new forms of existence arise, and not from idealistic requirement. To me, the crux of the spiritual problem today is to be found in the fascination which the psyche holds for modern man. If we are pessimists, we shall call it a sign of decadence. If we are optimistically inclined, we shall noteworthy because it is rooted in the deeper social strata, and the more important because it touches those irrational and, as history shows, incalculable psychic forces which transform the life of peoples and civilizations in ways that are unforeseen and unforeseeable. These are the forces still invisible to many persons today, which are at the bottom of the present psychological interest. The fascination of the psyche is not by any means a morbid perversity. It is an attraction so strong that it does not shrink even from what it finds repellent. Paragraph 192. Along the great highways of the world, everything seems desolate and outworn. Instinctively, modern man leaves the trodden paths to explore the byways and lanes, just as the man of Greco-Roman world cast off his defunct Olympian gods and turned to the mystery cults of Asia. Our instinct turns outward and appropriates Eastern theosophy and magic, but it also turns inward and leads us to contemplate the dark background of the psyche. It does this with the same skepticism and the same ruthlessness which impelled the Buddha to sweep aside his 2 million gods that he might attain the original experience which alone is convincing. Paragraph 193. And now we must ask a final question. Is what I have said of modern man really true, or is it perhaps an illusion? There can be no doubt whatever that to many millions of Westerners the facts I have adduced are wholly irrelevant and fortuitous, and regrettable aberrations to a large number of educated persons. But did a cultivated Roman think any differently when he saw Christianity spreading among the lower classes? Today, the God of the West is still a living person for vast numbers of people, just as Allah is beyond the Mediterranean, and the one believer holds the other, an inferior heretic, to be pitied and tolerated, failing all else. To make matters worse, the European is of the opinion that religion and such things are good enough for the masses and for women, but of little consequence compared with immediate economic and political questions. Paragraph 194. So I am refuted all along the line, like a man who predicts a thunderstorm when there is not a cloud in the sky, of consciousness. And when we speak of the spiritual problem of modern man, we are speaking of things that are barely visible. We are speaking of things that are barely visible, of the most intimate and fragile things, of flowers that open only in the night. In daylight, everything is clear and tangible, but the night lasts as long as the day, and we live in the nighttime also. There are people who have bad dreams which even spoil their days for them. And for many people, the day's life is such a bad dream that they long for the night when the spirit awakes. I believe that there are nowadays a great many such people, and this is why I also maintain that the spiritual problem of modern man is much as I have presented it. Keeping in mind now, he's writing in 1928, exactly 10 years after World War I and 11 years before World War II. And he said at one point that by 1919 he knew that there would be a World War II because he was seeing it in the dreams of his patients. Paragraph 195. I must plead guilty, however, to the charge of one-sidedness, for I have passed over in silence the spirit of the times, about which everyone has so much to say because it is so clearly apparent to us all. It shows itself in the ideal of internationalism and supernationalism, embodied in the League of Nations and the like. We see it also in sport and significantly in cinema and jazz. These are characteristic symptoms of our time, which has extended the humanistic ideal even to the body. Sport puts an exceptional valuation on the body, and this tendency is emphasized still further in modern dancing. The cinema, like the detective story, in age, it is not difficult to see how these symptoms link up with nature. We can hardly be surprised if this leads to a rediscovery of the body after it must give the body its due, and why recognition of the body cannot tolerate a philosophy that denies it in the name of spirit. These claims of physical and psychic life, incomparably stronger than they were in the past, may seem a sign of decadence, but they may also signify a rejuvenation, for as Holderlin says, where danger is, arises salvation also. Paragraph 196. And indeed we see, as the Western world strikes up a more rapid tempo, the American tempo, the exact opposite of quietism and world-negating resignation, an unprecedented tension arises between outside and inside, between objective and subjective reality. Perhaps it is a final race between aging Europe and young America. Perhaps it is a healthier or a last desperate effort to escape the dark sway of natural law and to wrest a yet greater and more heroic victory of waking consciousness over the sleep of the nations. This is a question only history can answer. Okay, so that's that. Strangely prophetic, written 90 years ago. So anyway, that's the end of the spiritual problem of modern man, and I'll go on with something else probably tomorrow or on Sunday. So have a nice weekend, and I'll see you soon.